Okay. Well, I got involved in this whole literacy question back in the 1950s when a friend of mine came to my office at Grosset and Dunlap, where I was working as an editor in New York City. And he asked me if I would join his national council, national advisory council for the Reading Reform Foundation, which he had just created. And I asked him, well, what was the purpose of the Reading Reform Foundation? And he said it was to get phonics back in the schools. Well, I looked at him with amazement. I said, what do you mean get phonics back in the schools? Since when was it taken out? And how can you possibly teach a child to read without it? And so he referred me to Rudolf Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, which had been published in 1955. And I read that book, and lo and behold, suddenly the whole world of the reading problem, I became aware of the reading problem, so to speak. And so I gladly joined his organization because I was a firm believer that you had to teach children to read by the phonetic method, otherwise they were not going to read very well. And of course, Flesch pointed out that we already had a reading problem in 1955. So I joined the organization, and then in the 1970s, when I began to write books, I decided to write a follow-up to Rudolf Flesch's book, because he only talked about things that had gone on until 1955, and here we were in the 70s, and the problem had not been solved. And I knew this firsthand because I was substituting in the schools, the public schools of Quincy, Massachusetts, and these kids were reading as if they were a bunch of foreigners who had just gotten off the boat. I could not believe what I was hearing. The way they read so falteringly, they misread words, they truncated words, it was horrible. And so I realized that the problem had not been solved. And so I decided to write a book on the subject, and it's called The New Illiterates. I have it here, which came out in 1973. And in it, I did research on the whole issue of how reading was taught in the United States. And I was very interested in finding out why or how anyone would think of teaching children to read by this whole word method, the Dick and Jane whole word method, which was being used in the schools and which was causing the reading problem. Well, I found out that the method had been invented by the Reverend Thomas Gallaudet back in the 1830s when he was running his school for the deaf and dumb. You see, the deaf could not hear the letter sounds, and so he taught them by a sight method, that is, words juxtaposed with pictures. And he thought that this, and so he had some limited success in teaching the deaf to read in a very simple way, and he thought that this method could be applied to normal children and save them the trouble of having to learn the letters of the alphabet and all those exercises, baby, bibo, bu, ab, ab, bab, and all of that. Well, it was tried in the Boston schools, and it was a disaster. And the schoolmasters there wrote a biting critique against this method. And they identified Gallaudet as the man who created it. Now, Gallaudet was, he had no axe to grind. He thought that he could be helpful. He believed that education was a science that could be improved. But he didn't complain when he found out that the method didn't work with normal children. He just didn't say anything about it. I could not find any comment that he made on it, except that he realized that he had made a mistake. But an interesting thing happened at that time. This was the late 1830s and early 1840s when Horace Mann became Secretary of Education. And they created the first government-controlled and financed teachers' college. And the first things that they taught at that teachers' college was the whole word method of teaching reading and phrenology, which was the earliest form of educational psychology. I don't know if you're familiar with phrenology, but it's the theory that all of our emotions and tendencies and are in the brain, in various parts of the brain. So, for example, intelligence is located in the frontal lobes, you know, so if you've got a high forehead, you're very intelligent and that sort of thing. And if you are a criminal type, then there's a part of your brain that is criminally inclined, and it's bigger than the other parts of the brain, you see. And so their solution to that problem was to have the child emphasize the more pacific part of the brain that was more peaceful and lovable, and that would offset the criminal part. Well, that was the kind of theory they had, and of course, it was total nonsense. It was not based on science, and the whole word method found its place in the government teachers' college, although the schools in Massachusetts and Boston went back to phonics. And
seeing we're here. Yes. How is it that, I mean, I can understand that the teacher of the deaf children could say, okay, well, look, I don't have a sound reference to teaching them, using some other reference to understand words makes perfect sense, and that there's a mistake in generalizing that to the population in general of hearing,
right,
where it is the base for, I mean, the learning to read has to evoke their normal experience of heard and spoken language.
That's right.
So there's a difference. I can see how, okay, one guy makes an over-travel, it gets tested. Why is it Horace Mann was championing this? What was his motive? How was it that this...
Well, Horace Mann was what you would call a progressive, a liberal. And they tended to consider the form of education that existed then to be a very conservative and not very joyful. In other words, the idea of having kids drill on the letter sounds, you know, the vowel consonant combinations, baby, bi, bo, bu, may, me, my, mo, mu, say, si, si, so, su, ab, eb, ib, ob, am, imam, ub. They consider that to be a, how would you say, a cruelty.
I thought his words were something to the effect of rote, tedious.
That's right, rote.
To these skeletal shapes.
That's right, you've got it down. As a matter of fact, I quoted him in my book, Is Public Education Necessary? But that was their point, that it was tedious and rote. They never liked rote learning. And even today, the progressives hate rote learning. But you see, rote learning is the easiest way to learn complex things. And if you don't use rote learning, then the kids have to think in terms of concepts. They have to think about it. You see, the whole purpose of rote learning, particularly when it comes to the alphabet and the alphabet sounds, is to create what I call a phonetic reflex. In other words, the automatic ability to associate letters with sounds. You see, that's a reflex. That becomes a reflex, a habit. What else is a reflex but a habit? Now, what the educators are doing, they're creating something which I call a holistic reflex. In other words, they teach the children a sight vocabulary, and every child in America is given a sight vocabulary to memorize. They're telling the children to recognize the word on the basis of its configuration, as if it were a Chinese character. And the children then learn to recognize these words by their shape, and once that becomes a habit, they develop what I call the holistic reflex. Now, the problem with the holistic reflex is that it creates an obstacle to seeing the words in their phonetic structure. You see, if you don't teach the children phonics, you're not teaching them the phonetic structure of our alphabetically written words. And if you're teaching them to look at all words as whole configurations, then you are creating an obstacle to seeing the words in their phonetic structure, and that is what is dyslexia. Dyslexia is the inability to see our alphabetically written words in their phonetic structure. You see, that's all it is. Now the way.
Your microphone twisted in.
Want me to start? Where did you end? What's okay?
Last we talked about was you'd written the book.
Yeah.
In the 70s.
Right.
And then we went into there to some of the specifics in the book.
Oh, okay. You want me to go back up? Yes. Should I start?
Yeah.
Well, in researching the book, The New Illiterates, and bringing the whole reading problem up to date, I wanted to find out who was the idiot who had decided that you could teach children to read by the whole word method. And much to my surprise, I found out that it wasn't an idiot. It was a very learned man, Reverend Thomas H. Gallaudet, who had founded the Hartford Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb. And he decided that the best way to teach the deaf to read was by a whole word method, because they could not hear the sounds of the language. And so he would teach them words, written words, in conjunction with pictures. So you had the word cat and a picture of a cat, and that's how they learned to read. Now, of course, that method worked with the deaf to a certain extent. It gave them some ability to read, rather simple text. And so Reverend Gallaudet thought, well, perhaps this method might also work with normal children. It would save them the problem of learning this time-consuming method, this rote method of memorizing the letter sounds, you know, the baby, bibo, bu, the mamie, mimo, mu, the abe, baba, that sort of thing, and that they could go directly to words, and after they had mastered, recognize, a certain number of words, then you would teach them the letter sounds. Well, this method was tried in the Boston schools on an experimental basis, and it produced a reading disaster. And so the Boston schoolmasters wrote a very biting critical review of the Gallaudet method, and they restored phonics to the schools of Boston. But meanwhile, Horace Mann, at the time, who was in favor of the look-say method, the whole word method, he also favored creating government-run teachers' colleges. He had been to Prussia, and he admired very much the Prussian way of doing things, that, you know, that they had that they controlled teachers' colleges, they had truancy laws, they had compulsory attendance laws and all of that. He liked that, and he thought that it would work in this country. And so the first things they taught in the new government teachers' colleges were the whole word method of teaching reading and phrenology. That is, this earliest form of educational psychology, in which they believed that the brain was composed of parts that represented certain aspects of human character and human nature. So that the frontal lobes represented intelligence, the area that represented criminal behavior was on a particular side, and that was the cause of criminal behavior. It was the brain, this big part of the brain devoted to that. And so they said the way that you can mitigate against criminal behavior is to exercise that part of the brain that was peaceful and conciliatory and lovable, you see. They identified that too. I imagine you've seen pictures of the Fowler's brain with all of the different compartments, you know, that became phrenology became, you know, was very much a big thing in this country in the 1850s and 60s and that sort of thing. But anyway, here was the first government-controlled teachers' colleges, and they started with miseducation and educational nonsense. So that tells you something about how the government does things.
Two questions come up right at this point. One was, speak to phonics when it first appears. Where does phonics come from? Why?
Yes.
One. And then two, relative to Horace Mann and the governmental institutionalizing of whole language, especially in the face of the negative experimental outcomes in Boston, it suggests an over bias to wanting to protect the emotions of children, protect them from the strain and struggle without any understanding of the necessity of the strain and struggle.
Well, one of the reasons why they were people like Horace Mann and his fellow progressives were against the phonics method is because, they did not like the rote learning. They wanted education to be soft and lovable and likable and enjoyable and amusing, and they didn't like anything that the conservatives were doing. You see, the conservatives realized that if you want to become a competent reader, you have to learn the alphabetic, the letter sounds, and the only way that children could do that in those days was through rote learning, through drill. And of course, the progressives had a totally different view of human nature. They thought that if you softened everything, that everything would come out okay because you were lovable and likable and rejected rote learning and rejected punishment and rejected discipline. You see, they were against all of those things as they are today. Nothing has really changed. So you have this struggle that's been going on between conservatives and liberals since Horace Mann. Well, the interesting thing about the two methods, however, and the early critics of the method, the schoolmasters who wrote in the 1840s in their report on Horace Mann's 7th annual report, his famous report, they were absolutely against what he was doing because they said that you are destroying education. They said that education, that to be truly educated requires work. It requires labor. You don't get to the top of the mountain, by being tossed up. You have to climb step by step. And so they were very much against what Horace Mann and the liberals stood for. But in any case, they also analyzed the look-say method and why it didn't work. They said that when you learn to read by word recognition only, that you develop this blockage against seeing words in their phonetic structure. Now, perhaps I should say something about how phonics was invented or how the phonetic system was invented. Well, the earliest form of writing that human beings did was drawing pictures on the walls of caves. You didn't have to go to school to learn to recognize a picture. A man looked like a man, an animal looked like an animal. But then as civilization became more complex, the scribes had to draw pictures of things that did not lend themselves to depiction. For example, concepts. Let's take the concept of method. How do you draw a picture of method? You can't. How do you draw a picture of determination? You can't. So what do? You draw a symbol and you say, this stands for determination, this stands for system or method. And so the scribes created thousands of such symbols that took years to learn. And so literacy was restricted to a small number of scribes and priests who literally controlled the civilization because they could read whatever was written. Well, somewhere around 2,000 years BC, somebody made a remarkable discovery. Somebody discovered that all of human language, everything we speak, is really composed of a small number of irreducible speech sounds. And that individual said, well, why don't I create a set of symbols to stand just for the speech sounds of the language, and then we will be able to transcribe everything we say into a code, an easily recognizable and learned code, and then we could easily then read what has been written back into the spoken form, you see. So that's how the alphabet was invented. They say that it was invented by the Phoenicians. We really don't know why. It's a big mystery as to how the alphabet was invented. And I always point out to people that I lecture to about the alphabet is that it's very interesting that Moses was taught to read by the hieroglyphic method. And yet when he went up to Mount Sinai, he came down with the Ten Commandments written in alphabetic writing. So I always ask the question, who taught God the alphabet? But you see the difference. The difference, in other words, alphabetic writing made it easy to learn to read. And as a result, you had the tremendous expansion of vocabulary among the Greeks. They wrote these great plays. They wrote about philosophy. The Bible was written in alphabetic writing. The scripture was written in alphabetic writing. So all of a sudden, human beings could learn to read. The Romans used their alphabet. They adopted a different alphabet as the Greek. So you had the Hebrew alphabet, the Greek alphabet, the Roman alphabet. Now, when the Romans conquered England, they imposed their alphabet, which stood for the Latin language, on the people in England, who spoke a conglomeration called Anglo-Saxon or whatever. But the interesting thing about that is that whereas Latin has a much smaller number of sounds, in English we have many more sounds. We have a 26-letter alphabet, but how many sounds do we have in the English language? I always ask that of my audience, and I said, you know, you should have been taught this in kindergarten. Very few people know how many sounds there are in the English language. It's like 1,000, 75, you know. I said, no, there are only 44 sounds in English, 44 sounds. And we have a 26-letter alphabet to stand for 44 sounds. So you're going to have some problems. Some of the letters are going to have to stand for more than one sound. Take, for example, the letter A. It stands for A, as in cat. It stands for A, as in apron. It stands for A, as in car. And it stands for, there was one other sound that slips me at the moment, but it stands for 4 different sounds. And how do you learn these sounds? How do you learn which letters stand for which sounds? And I said, you have to teach the child the sounds in their spelling families. And that's what I did in the back of the New Illiterates. I put in my first phonics program there, and I taught children to read in a very simple, direct way, teaching them first the short A sound with the consonants, and then the rest of the short vowels with the consonants, and then into the blends, you know, like TR and SP and all of that. And then finally, and also the SH sound. You see, in that case, you have 2 letters that stand for one sound. Sh. SH stands for sh. CH for ch. And TH, which is typically English, for the, you see. So that's how we've accommodated a 26-letter alphabet with 44 sounds. And of course, when it...
So in that sense, you'd say phonics is a way of teaching so as to compensate for the lack of letter-sound correspondence that the alphabet originally enjoyed.
Well, phonics is simply the method of teaching the children to read by learning the letter sounds in all of their complexity. And it can be done easily, or it can be done, you can make it difficult and you can make it easy.
But the point is that, for example, the Romans didn't need phonics.
Oh, yes, they did.
They did.
Oh, yes, the Romans had a very strict phonetic method. They used the drill, the baby bibo bu.
My understanding was that the Romans and the Greeks, their sound system and the alphabet matched very closely. They didn't have the problem of having twice as many sounds.
Yeah, that's true. But they nevertheless used the drill method of inculcating the letter sounds, so that, first of all, in Greece and in Rome, you didn't have any pictures, you see. You were doing, what they did was they used wax and a stylus for writing, you see, in Rome and Greece. And
now you're talking about ingraining the type correspondence of letters and sounds.
Right. Right.
Get the alphabetic principal correspondence of letters
Right.
and sounds. Drill till that's really clear.
Exactly.
And thereafter, reading is a case of seeing the letter, hearing or speaking
Right.
the sound, and running it together fast.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, in Roman writing, you had no punctuation, you had no separation of words, and you read it like you read music, you know. You just read, the letters stood for sounds, and so you became a reader. Now, when it came to England, where you had this problem, this spelling problem, I mean, if you read Elizabethan writing, you will see that they wrote phonetically, but they would write the same word in two different ways in the same sentence because the dictionary had not been invented. You see, once the dictionary was invented, then spelling was standardized, you see. And that's what took place with Samuel Johnson, and he created the first dictionary. And once spelling became standardized, then spelling became very important, and punctuation and grammar and all of that, which became very much part of the educational system. Now, back in the Elizabethan times, the children were taught Latin, and they were taught Latin grammar, and they were taught Latin words and how to read Latin, and we know that Marlowe and Shakespeare all had to know Latin because they used it so frequently, but it also helped them in learning English because so many of the English words were derived from Latin. See, the interesting thing about English is that you've got Anglo-Saxon, you've got French, you've got German, you've got Norwegian, you've got Danish, and even Spanish, you know, like different words, French words like rendezvous, you see, from France, you know, or boudoir, which are English words, and yet we have to spell them. And so our problem of having 26 letters and 44 sounds created a spelling problem for us. And the only way that you could learn to spell correctly is to learn each spelling family. To spell, for example, when I teach the long A in my phonics program, I show the student that there are 5 different spellings to the same sound. For example, long A, you have simple A, as in apron or April. Then you have A consonant E, as in cake or bake or fate. Then you have AI, as in cane, C-A-I-N, or rain, R-A-I-N. As a matter of fact, we've got 3 rains. We've got R-E-I-N, R-A-I-N, and R-E-I-G-H-N, you know. So we have a spelling problem in English, and that's why spelling bees are so interesting.
And the spelling process is a consequence of the collision of the English oral language
Right.
and the Latin Roman writing system.
Well, yeah, in other words, we've adopted many, you know, Roman words, Latin words, Latin words, Greek words, but you can easily recognize the Latin words and the Greek words. The Greek words have PH in them, you know, like symphony, Y, and the the Latin words, of course, we use so many of the prefixes and the suffixes that create new words all the time. But you see, alphabetic writing permits you to create new words all the time. Take, for example, the word geek, or, you know, where did it come from? Who invented it? But yet you can write it, you say it, and you write it. What's a geek? We all know what a geek is, you know. Computer language. I mean, it all comes, you can do it by phonics, but the Chinese have a terrible problem inventing new words. They can't, because who's in charge of all those characters? You can't make up your own character in China and go around saying, well, here's a new character and it stands for this. So what they've done in Chinese is they take the old characters and put them together to stand for ideas like electricity. Their word for electricity is a combination of two words, something that has to do with fire and light and that sort of thing. But we can construct new words on the basis of prefixes and suffixes and that sort of thing.
We have an erector set for being able to
Exactly, and it's unlimited.
Right.
It's unlimited.
However, back to the point about the spelling thing is that it is unlimited, and because of the imprecise match between the letters and the sounds, it became there was so much room for interpretation that it bred lots of spelling problems until the printing press and the dictionaries come in and define some reference standard for them.
Yes. Well, yes. In other words, the dictionary is our source of correct spelling, because even I, as a experienced writer, sometimes has to look up a word to make sure that there are two L's or two F's or that sort of thing. Which it's easy to forget, especially at my age. But even young people have that problem. Now, the new SATs have a writing section where the youngsters are going to have to write an essay. And I believe that many of them are going to have terrible spelling problems, because I've seen some of the examples of today's children who will learn to spell by the so-called creative spelling process, where the kids are not taught to spell correctly. They're encouraged to spell any way they want, you see. But you can't do that with our language, because if you spell a word phonetically, purely phonetically, you may spell it wrong, you see, because we have certain rules in our spelling system. And what I do in my Alpha Phonics spelling, in my reading program, is I introduce each spelling pattern or spelling family and the words in them. And that helps the children become good spellers, you see. But as I say, you can be an experienced writer and still, have to look up a word in the dictionary, which is perfectly all right. But spelling is important in America. And I'll give you a very good example of how important it is. We had a vice president by the name of, I'm sure you remember him, who misspelled potato by he added an E to potato. And he's been the butt of jokes ever since, and his entire political career was ruined. And incidentally, potato, the added E is an alternative spelling. It's not a misspelling. And yet they came down on this poor man like you wouldn't believe.
I know exactly who you're talking about. I think of it.
Well, Dan Quayle, yes. Poor Dan Quayle has been the butt of jokes, Leno and all of those, and they won't let him alone. It's too good a joke. And there's an example where you can be ruined, but it depends on who you are. If you're a liberal and you make a spelling error, nobody bothers to correct you. But if you're a conservative and make a spelling error, then of course it becomes national news, a headline.
This is a good place, I think, to start our segue into more specifics. I really enjoyed the history. We've interviewed a number of people to try to get different, go into
Right.
places here in Greece, in the Hebrew world, the Phoenician, Romans, John Fisher, who wrote the book on how the standardization of English systems merged in the
Yes.
15th century under King Henry V, the effect of the printing press. But it seems underlying all of this, basically what we're talking about is a code that has this many sound elements and this many graphic elements. They don't match.
Mm-hmm.
A small number of scribes working for this King Henry V.
Yes.
In 1430, 26 of them, who didn't go to school to read and speak English. English was the peasant language, comparatively.
Well, that's true. You spoke it.
They call it patois.
Right.
Linguistic language. And these are the people that figured out how to combine these letters and what have you and make what would be the seed bed of the rules that would emerge.
Right.
That got subsequently fixed more as the printing press technicians came in with their listenings for sounds.
Right.
And later got fixed when the dictionary people came along and said, wait a minute, there's just too many erratic variations.
That's right.
Some standards here.
Yeah.
But ultimately, these are all compensational mechanics trying to deal with the fact that, unlike in the days of the Greeks and Romans and Hebrews, there wasn't a good match between the sounds and letters.
Well, you know, as a matter of fact, we have languages today that are perfectly phonetically perfect. For example, Spanish. The letter A in Spanish stands for only one sound, ah. The letter E stands for A, the letter I stands for E, and that's it. You know, you don't have any problem with Spanish. And there are other languages like that. But unfortunately, English, which incidentally, because of its conglomeration, is an enormously rich language and is wonderful for poetry. Tremendously, you know, it's a tremendous language for poetry. As a matter of fact, we have produced the world's greatest literature with our language, with the English language.
Well, certainly we would think so.
Well, you know, if you look at Shakespeare and Milton and our poets, we have produced virtually I don't think they're, you know, maybe Goethe, you know, might be equal in German, or in France you had Molière and others, but certainly not to the extent that English has been able to be used so well, so beautifully. The language is just gorgeous because of its tremendous variety of sounds.
Because of the space that the ambiguity
right.
toward power makes possible.
That's right, that's right. And that's all the more reason why children should be taught to read English by the phonetic method, by phonics, so that then they can have this tremendous treasure, this incredible legacy for themselves to be able to read anything, you know.
We could say that it is a fantastic language for an adult who's mastered it.
That's true.
And it is, compared to other systems, perhaps a more difficult thing to master.
Well, you know, it's interesting, though, but English has become the international language. I was in China last year, and everybody wants to learn English, you know, because, and people talk about the Chinese one day, you know, becoming the most powerful nation in the world. It'll never happen. Why? Because of their language. Nobody wants to learn Chinese. It's so difficult. It's a very difficult language to learn. And you would think that they would Romanize it. But you see, if they Romanize Chinese, then all of their literature would be lost in one generation, because the kids would not bother to learn the characters. They would forget them because they're so difficult to learn. And that's why it takes much longer for a Chinese child to memorize 5,000 characters than it does for an American child to learn, you know, 26 letters and 44 sounds. And that's why when the Chinese come here and they master English, wow, their intelligence soars. You know, they become PhDs, they become, you know, computer experts, software experts, engineers. It's marvelous what English does for the Chinese, you see. So language, as a matter of fact, I believe that the Chinese language has been a tremendous obstacle to their development, you know, into 21st century civilization. So everything they have that's moving ahead comes from the English. You see, comes from the English language.
Did you ever read The Alphabet Effect? Logan and McLuhan?
No, I haven't read their book. I've read another book on the alphabet, which is similar to that.
Yeah, it takes the position that the difference in our society, Western and Eastern society, is really a difference in the way
Absolutely.
systems have affected consciousness, abstraction, generalization.
Exactly.
In general.
Yes. And of course, if you begin to teach children to read English as if it were Chinese, as if it were a picture language, you're going to have a decline not only of literacy, but you're going to have a decline in the development of intelligence and intellectual ability. Cognitive skills are declining in this country because the kids cannot read well enough. And this has been particularly damaging to the minorities, particularly to the black minority. It's interesting, when I studied the literacy in this country, how it was increasing. And black literacy was increasing every year by, you could tell by the census, number of readers, etc. And then when we come to after the 1930s, it begins to decline. So now only 50% of blacks can read. That is, to read competently. You know, they can recognize words like exit, you know, or slow, or stop, but they cannot deal with the language. They don't have that language skill. And I believe that and what has happened as a result is you've had this development of oral communication, you know, such as rap and music, as a substitute for the written word. But during the 30s and prior to that, black writers were becoming superior in the use of language. Take, for example, James Baldwin, or so many other of the black writers who were taught phonics and taught to read in the standard American way, standard English way, and they developed into great writers. Whereas today, and that's not only true of blacks, for example. You look at today's bestsellers. Go into any bookstore, Barnes & Noble's, Borders, pick up a book that sells in millions of copies, and you will see that it's written very simply. The vocabulary is at a 6th grade level at the most. Lots of space, short sentences, lots of he said, she said. You can see how the writer has adapted his writing style to the reading ability of today's audiences. Now, I collect old magazines. I collect antiquarian magazines. You should read the way writing was written back in the 1850s and 60s. I mean, today's kids would be unable to read them, these long sentences. Sometimes a whole page, one sentence, you know. As a matter of fact, there was one professor who wrote a book on the subject of literacy who said, he said that his college students could not read Henry James. He said when they were reading Henry James, they looked like fish on the shore, you know, flapping and trying to get back into water. They could not handle that kind of writing. And and the result is that we've had a tremendous decline in literacy skills in this country. Now, we know how to teach reading in the correct way. I mean, I know how to do it. Certainly, they knew how to do it back then. How come today's educators don't know how to do it? How come they're using a method that is producing widespread reading disability? Why do they persist in using that method?
Before we go on to the, by the way, back in 1987, got a general theory of learning and education that called the insidious curriculum. So, you know, many years later, when I bumped into your discussion of pedagogical poison,
Yes.
There's a real connection that opens up my listening to you. So I really want to go into that. How is it that we are creating environments that are causing the cognitive infrastructure of children to malform in a way
Yes.
that's learning disabled?
Right.
I mean, that's the part of it.
Yeah.
However, before we go to that, let's come back and say, what is reading? What is reading?
Well, reading is translating the written symbols into speech. That's what it is, because our reading system, our code, is a sound system code. sound. You look at the letters, you hear the sounds. In other words, it's perfectly okay for you to articulate what you're reading. For example, poetry. You're going to read poetry out loud. You're going to read Shakespeare out loud because it was written to be read out loud, you see. Now, of course, there's some dense writing. Some engineers and scientists and mathematicians write in such ways that are very difficult to fathom, so to speak. But nevertheless, good writing should be easily transferable into speech. Good writing.
By speech, you mean virtual or actual, thought or spoken?
Well, it's spoken. I mean, it has to be spoken because we have a sound symbol system. And the system is based on taking speech and using a code to put it into a written form, you see.
Right, but if you read it and you don't move your mouth, is it still speech?
Oh, yeah, you don't have to move your mouth.
Okay, so
You don't have to move your mouth.
It's inside.
It's interior, internal speech. You have to hear it. You have to hear what you're reading. If you're just looking at a symbol, take, for example, the symbol in the airport, a circle and a cigarette and a slash through it. Well, you look at that. Now, that's an ideograph. It stands for an idea. The idea says, you may not smoke, no smoking, smoking prohibited, fumar prohibido, défense de fumer. In other words, you can use any form to translate that, and you're perfectly correct. It's perfectly correct to say that that symbol says smoking forbidden.
Crosses all the languages.
Exactly. So, but if you see the sign that says no smoking, NOSMOKING, that does not say smoking prohibited. That does not say défense de fumer. That says no smoking, you see. Now, we have a problem these days in airports where they use a lot of these symbols now, these pictographs. For example, if you want to go to the restroom, you have to look and see if it's a person wearing a skirt or person wearing pants. But today, a lot of women wear pants. So you ask yourself, well, which door are they going to go into? You see? So you have to have also gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, you see, or messieurs, dames et messieurs.
The point is to save the space and create a generalized concept identifier that will work across the language.
Yeah, and of course that's helpful in international airports and things like that, especially where if you're an American and if you're traveling abroad and you don't speak the language or can't read it, you'd like an English sign. For example, when I was in China, I was delighted that so many of the Chinese signs on the road particularly were also accompanied by English signs, but I don't know where they got their English from. For example, they would say that the main road would be the carriageway. Where did they get that idea? That, you know,
The way the carriages went.
yeah, the carriageway. I imagine that a Chinese bureaucrat, in trying to come up with English words for road signs, went to a dictionary and figured it out that way, you know. I found that amusing, you see, that they would do that sort of thing. But nevertheless, it was understandable to an English reading person.
So back to reading, we're saying that reading brings about an experience of speech.
Yes.
Either spoken externally
Right.
or spoken to oneself.
Right.
Oneself.
Right.
And which is different than queuing up a conceptual, image-based recognition. It's queuing up the experience of the sound of a word.
Exactly. Now, you know, there are lots of puzzles these days using rebuses, You know what a rebus is. It's a little symbol that stands for a word. For example, if you want to say treason, for example. So you have a tree and a picture of the sun. So you say, oh, treason. But they don't look like treason, do they? But that's the rebus idea. And, you know, you could play around with that sort of thing. But if you had the word treason, that would be direct, quick, easy, you see. And so phonetic writing facilitates reading. It facilitates the use of ideas, the growth of ideas. It facilitates the growth of intellect. You know, now I am presently working on a book on the Shakespeare authorship question, and I've had to do an enormous amount of reading in all kinds of books. And after a while, you learn how to scan. You know, they talk about speed reading. The only thing that speed reading is scanning. You know, learning how to scan so that you don't miss too much that's important. But nevertheless, you can't scan a poem. You have to read a poem word for word, you see, in order to get the message.
In order for it to conduct
the experience, the emotion. Right.
Hunt and seek scan for gems of
Right.
information.
In other words, the whole business of the development of language is very much coincides very much with the writing system that you have. In other words, if you have a writing system that permits you to invent new words, you're going to have words, you know, new words all the time, and that's why they have to keep printing new editions of dictionaries, because there are so many new words being invented. Take, for example, the whole business of computer. The word email never existed before the advent of the computer. Download, log in. I mean, there are all sorts of concepts now that we very easily write. But how do you write log in Chinese? How do you write download in Chinese? Who's in charge of the symbols? Who's in charge of the characters there? You know?
Back to reading. We're about to come to a final. So we've been evolving for a long period of time, tuning our brains and articulatory structures.
Right.
The particular kind of confusion associated with reading are only a few hundred years old and only been recently experienced by any mass of us.
Right. Well, today in America, we have a massive reading problem, and that's because of the way reading is taught in our schools. You see, in our schools, the children are taught by a sight vocabulary to develop a holistic reflex. That is, they are trained to look at each English word as a whole configuration, like a Chinese symbol. And so the children are not taught to see the phonetic structure of the word. And so when they develop this holistic reflex, that creates a barrier. It creates an obstacle to seeing words in their phonetic structure. And that's what is known as dyslexia. What is a dyslexic? It's an individual who cannot see the phonetic structure of our words. Now, and so children are being trained that way, and so when they reach the third grade, see, the first grade teacher is not aware of what she's doing. That by teaching a sight vocabulary, I call it the thalidomide of primary education, the teaching of a sight vocabulary. And most parents will accept it. You know, the kids are memorizing these words. It sounds harmless. It looks harmless, yet it's very damaging because it's creating this holistic reflex. Now, it was Pavlov who discovered how to artificially create reading disability, how to artificially create disorder, human disorder, misbehavior, and this is the way he did it. by posing the animal with two opposing reflexes, you see. Ringing a bell and then doing something else so that the animal was paralyzed. It could not move, confused. Now, if you teach a child to develop a holistic reflex and then he is taught some phonics, he cannot develop a phonetic reflex because he has not been drilled in the manner that produces a reflex. You see, that's why the ancients knew how to do it. They drilled the child so that he or she developed a reflex, a phonetic reflex. And that's the way it was done in this country.
Yes, but the comparison has to take into account, though, the fact that in that day there was a correspondence, and in this day there's not. There was no internal assembly required.
Well, but there is...
compared to the internal assembly required to make letters and sounds work together today.
Well, but it does exist. I was taught phonics when I went to school. I was taught the short vowels. I was taught A, E, I, O, U, A. I memorized that. I knew that. I wasn't taught all of the other finenesses of our system. For example, oo and food, good food, the double O spelling. I wasn't taught. They didn't bother with that. They figured that you'll figure it out for yourself, you see, which many of us did, but we didn't know that there were actually 44 sounds. There are actually 20 vowel sounds in English, which is amazing.
People I've talked to, there's 26 letters that can represent 44 to Vinesky would say 50. Vinesky was America's leading orthographer. And that there's 1,100 ways those 26 letters can combine to represent.
Well, yeah, but it's much simpler than that.
I'm not arguing that it is.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that it's all a lot more complicated than it was in the days of learning to read Hebrew or the ancient
Yeah.
or Roman or Greek.
Right. No, you're absolutely you are right. Our spelling system requires much more time and practice. For example, if you want to become a writer, I often am asked questions by parents. How can I improve my child's spelling? They'll always tell me he reads very well, but he's horrible at spelling, because that's what he had creative spelling in school. I say the simplest way to have a child learn to spell is have him to copy correctly spelled text. If he does that long enough, he will know how to spell. Very simple. All it does is take a little work, And I said, and he could copy something that he enjoys reading. He doesn't have to, he doesn't have to copy things out of the waste rubbish journal. He can read something that, he can read something that's of interest to him and learn to spell at the same time. As a matter of fact, that's how writers learn to spell. By doing it, by writing, And today's kids are not taught spelling. They're not taught that it's important. It's downgraded. I mean, I read what the teachers are writing. As a matter of fact, they're even saying that writing is out of fashion. Just learn the keyboard. And most kids don't even learn the keyboard correctly. They do the hunt and peck. Learning to type correctly requires you learning touch typing, which I was taught. That was the most practical thing I was taught in public school. In junior high school, I was taught touch typing. And we learned to touch typing by typing according to March Slav by Tchaikovsky. Dum, 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 dum.
It's a great place for a tape break. If you need to take a break and get up and move, we're going to change the tape and go for a while.
Well, okay. No, and the power of speech. He didn't give it to any of the other animals. He only gave it to man. And why did he give it to man? So that he could communicate with man. You see, it's as simple as that.
It is the drive to communicate that has perfected and driven the evolution of our
You're right. Yeah, sure.
Where we start.
Yeah, wherever you start. Oh, of course, Adam's language is not our language. He started at the very beginning.
Some of the ancient Sanskrit I've been exposed to seems much more ecological and compressed.
Yeah.
The way that we write. It's hard to say. I think the thing though is that speech is one thing, and having an externally invented convention system, cueing the assembly of an artificial experience of
Right.
speaking, is another business altogether.
Mm. Well, what does Shaywitz say about this? Did you discuss this with her?
A little bit.
My concern, however, as a writer, has been on the miseducation that's taking place, whereby we are creating dyslexics, we are creating reading disabled youngsters in the schools, and Ed Miller proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt, because he has tested the kids in the schools. And he has a test that determines whether you are a holistic reader or a phonetic reader. And he shows how even those kids who begin as a phonetic reader, when he tested them several years later, were dumbed down. They were not reading as well as they were at the beginning, when probably they had been taught phonics at home or something like that.
This is an important point. Let's be careful about this and go into this slowly together so we track well. Right now, the tide has swung. The reading first people, the No Child Left Behind people, the reading czar of America, Reed Lyon,
Yeah.
Child Health and Human Development, Russ Whitehurst. The consensus is no question: kids need phonics,
Right.
particularly depending upon their level of readiness when they start the reading challenge. Right? That most of them will say that the child who has a robust oral language capacity, who is quick of mind, so to speak, in that they're less dependent on the methodology of teaching. That the less somebody's developed in their core language ability, the more dependent they are on explicit phonical instruction to get through the reading.
Well, that's true. I mean, I didn't, and that's why the old method worked so well with everybody, because they were drilled, you see. So even those children who had a low level of, say, a language development, whatever, was slow in their language development, by having to repeat baby, bye, bo, bu, over and over again, and may, me, my, mo, mu, and te, ti, tai, to, tu, and all of that, it helped them. You see, in other words, we've discarded that wonderful drill, which helped everybody. And we've substituted instead a method that is very helpful for the bright and the brilliant, makes it easy for them to learn, but much more difficult for the slow learners, you see.
Right, and I think
and they won't go back to that because it's R-O-T-E, rote.
Well, yeah, I gotta be careful. I think you're generalizing about the way it was. My understanding, if I was to make a generalization today, I'd say the pendulum is all but swung back to phonics.
Well, that's what we've been told. But, I have my friend in Texas who's in a school, and he teaches phonics, and he says he has to do it very quietly. He's the only one in his school. He tries to get the other teachers interested. They're not. You're getting tremendous resistance on the part of your regular teachers who have been taught in their teachers' colleges, and also your professors of education, who are the most duplicitous and deceptive individuals in the education system. I've offered my services to every university in this area, because I'm the world's greatest expert on the teaching of reading by phonics. I know how to do it, and I know how to take a school and make it superior as far as reading is concerned. I can't get in there. And I look at the faculty, and you'll see people who were in the International Reading Association, which has been the hotbed of whole language and all of that stuff. And so
Timothy Shanahan is president next year.
And who Timothy Shanahan is going to be president of the IRA next year.
Right. And
He's a Phonics man.
Phonics, and he is a member of the National Reading Panel.
Well, look at it.
All I'm saying is that
Yeah, but what I get from the field is a totally different story. And let me tell you, oh, wait a minute, let me even tell you another story that's even more horrible. Years ago, when I was in California, I asked this lady friend of mine, Sue Dixon, who had created a phonics reading program, if her program was being used anywhere in the United States. And she said, well, it's being used in this school in this town, Selma, California, the Washington Elementary School. Well, I happened to be in that area. I was on a lecture tour, and I stopped in, and I met the teacher. She was using Sue Dixon's phonetic program, and all the children were learning to read, and they were doing extremely well. And it was written up in the newspapers and all of that, but the rest of the state didn't care what she was doing. Anyway, she was doing well. Well, in 2001, I had the opportunity to revisit that school. And this was after it had been known that whole language had destroyed literacy in California. I go there, and what are they using? A whole language program. I could not understand how this lady, who knew that phonics worked so well, would switch over to whole language. Why? She liked her job. As simple as that. She knew that the forces above were so powerful that if she did not use whole language, they'd kick her out. They'd get her out. They'd force her out. And she wasn't about to let that happen. So I was terribly disappointed, but what did it tell me? That after all of this had been revealed about what was going on in California, and I predicted that that would happen in my newsletter. I'm going to give you my newsletters, you could read them. I predicted what would happen, and of course what happened was they didn't change over. I mean, the legislature might have said they should change over. People in Washington might have said that they should change over. But in the teaching establishment, no such thing happened. As a matter of fact, it went just the opposite. So my view today is that you cannot trust the public schools to do what the linguistic professors of linguistics want done, or Reed Lyon wants done, or what No Child Left Behind wants done, etc., because it's so easy to say that you're using phonics. You know, when parents come to me and they tell me what's going on in the schools, and they ask the teacher, are you teaching phonics? Well, they all say yes. They're teaching phonetic clues. But then I say, but you're asking the wrong question. What you have to ask the teacher, do you teach a sight vocabulary? They'll all say yes. Now, you cannot combine a sight vocabulary with phonics. You produce that confusion, that crash between two reflexes that create the disability that Pavlov discovered.
Okay, good. Now, in conversation with Vinesky and some of the neuroscientists, they would say that reading has multiple loops happening, right? That we're getting cues from many different planes of information processing. Visual previews, we're getting the phonological previews. Our brain's assembling this thing from many different things at once. And that a good reader is recognizing a word as a whole. They're not sounding it out anymore.
Well, when you've been reading for years the same word, you don't have to. You know, for example, a parent will say to me, my child keeps saying que at te. He's learning phonics, and I say, well, don't worry. Eventually, he'll get tired of saying que at te, and he'll say cat, because there is that process, that internal process, whereby what we learn phonetically, we then speed it up to the point where it seems as if we're reading whole words, but we're not. We're reading the phonetic word in its whole form in the fastest method possible. So, but if you ask somebody to break that word up into its phonetic components, you can do it. Now, when you come across a new word, take for example one of these new pharmaceutical terms, and if you want to read the ingredients, say in a vitamin tablet, well, there are these words that you have to slowly, read them syllable by syllable before you can then read them over and over again. And we use them like amphetamine, the word amphetamine. I guess when you first saw the word amphetamine, you had a problem reading it, and you broke it up into its syllables, and then you're able to, now when you see the word, say amphetamine, you don't have to sound out every syllable, you see. So there is that interesting process. It's a learning process, but it's also the same kind of process that takes place when you learn to drive. Nowadays people drive and they have a phone, they're drinking coffee, they're even reading the newspaper while they're driving. Why? Because the driving has become automatic. In other words, we have developed reflexes, automatic reflexes, that permit us to drive and to hold conversations and do other things. But supposing you went over to England and you rented a car, and suddenly you had to drive on the left side of the road, not the right side of the road, you would have a tough time having a conversation with somebody. You would have to pay attention to every little thing you were doing if you didn't want to get, killed by a speeding double-decker bus. I don't know if you've been to England and have had that experience.
I drove around in China on the wrong side of the
Okay, all right. Yeah. All right, well, then you know what it's like. You know what it's like. Well, it's the same thing with reading. I mean, if you're reading a new language, you may want, it'll be slower. But if you're reading English, and if you've been doing it so often, of course it's going to be speedy to the point where you think that you're reading whole words, that you're not reading phonetically, but you are. It's just that you know the phonetics to the point where it's a reflex, you see. And that makes a big difference. But you see, you can, the whole language people will say, well, even experienced readers read whole words. Well, of course we read whole words. We're not going to stop and at for every word, every time we see a phonetic word,
Good. I just wanted to draw that out. That's an important distinction. I mean, it's really clear that a really good reader doesn't read the same way that somebody who's struggling to learn to read.
That's right. That's right.
When the struggle of learning to read has to approach and apply themselves to that process.
That's right.
It's entirely different than a good reader reads.
Exactly. Right.
So let's go to pedagogical poison. Let's bring out what is it that happens to worsen the confusion already implicit in this writing system when there's these conflicting methods in mind. I think you've touched on that pretty well.
Yes.
Quick summary cut on that.
Well, as I said, I've called, and I've written it in my book, that the sight vocabulary is the thalidomide of primary education. In other words, when you deliberately require a child to look at our English words as if they were whole configurations like Chinese symbols, you're doing great damage to that child, because you're preventing that child from seeing the phonetic structure of the words. And when you do that, you create the symptoms of dyslexia. You create the symptoms of reading disability. You create functional illiteracy, because unless that child is taught to read phonetically with drills so that he develops a phonetic reflex, that child is never going to become a good reader. You must develop a phonetic reflex. As a matter of fact, that's the only way that you can cure dyslexia. Now, I have tutored a lot of young people who were taught to read by the whole word method. And the way I cure them, the way I turn them into phonetic readers, is to first teach them our entire phonetic system. So they go through my entire alphabetic program, Alpha Phonics, so that they learn the sounds and the symbols, and they learn the letter sounds. Then once they've learned the sounds, How do you make it automatic? How do you turn it into a reflex? Well, I have them read text to me, and usually we use the Reader's Digest. And you will find that they make all kinds of mistakes. They leave out words that are there. They put in words that aren't there. They truncate words. They misread words. They just don't, they skip words. So you know what they're doing. You know what poor readers they are. And what you do is you have to stop them every time they make one of these errors. For example, if they leave out a word, you say, reread that until they become aware of the errors they've been making, you see.
So you need to draw their attention to where it is that they're not functioning well so that they get it.
That's right. And they see, oh, yes, I left out the word to. Might be a small word, but it's there. Now, if they put in a word that's there, you have them read over until they realize, hey, that word's not in the text,
Good, good. This is perfect. Now, there's one point I really like to get to before we wrap, which had to do with some of the statements that you made about special education. Now, clearly there's a connection between reading difficulty, which is the primary thing that's causing kids to fall into special education.
Right.
And the point that you were making was that special education was creating a condition in which children were learning to accept their failure, learning to give up self-direction and self-motivation,
Right.
learning to surrender to somebody else conducting them step, step, step.
Well, the interesting thing about dyslexia is that there is a whole industry that has grown up over the reading disability problem. If you attend a convention for the hard of hearing, you will find that there are all sorts of programs dealing with dyslexia that don't cure it. For example, they will use cue analysis and all sorts of programs invented by the Goodmans. I don't know if you're familiar with. Well, naturally, he won't talk to you because he's one of the men. He and his wife have done more to destroy literacy in this country than any other two people. But you will see that they will tell a child that he's perfectly literate if he reads in the manner of a functional illiterate. They'll say, oh, well, that's literacy. You're quite literate, you see. They don't make the distinction between being a competent reader and an incompetent reader. To them, if you can recognize the word exit, you're literate.
As I understand it, from conversations with Ellington, who has talked with me, but Krashen, who has talked with me. I've tried to talk to anybody who's got an angle on
Right.
I don't have crude generalizations. I think all of it's pretty crude, frankly.
Right.
These things are, what we're talking about is an unnatural, artificial form of confusion. We're not helping our children through it very well.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
With respect to the way this is functioning, what their perception is that we need to create a language environment that the child's natural interest and motivation pulls them into learning to imbibe the automaticity of processing this code. And in a purely phonetic language, that might be possible. That might be entirely
Well,
in the case of having to deal with all of the complex irregularities, which have no natural correspondence to the kind of confusion the brain encounters out in nature.
Right.
It's purely technological. It isn't going to work.
Well, the whole business of creating this literate atmosphere, as whole language people do, where they have things on the walls and posters and surround the kids with books which they can't read, that somehow through osmosis, they say children will learn to read the way they learn to speak. Well, that's totally different because learning to read is an artificial thing, while learning to speak is a perfectly natural ability that everyone is born with. But we're not born with the ability to learn to read, because if we were, there would be no illiteracy, So that argument is just so perfectly nonsensical.
Before the light creeps up to your...
Yeah. Oh, that's coming, yeah. Well, I can move.
No, you're doing
Yeah.
fine. I think we've got enough light left.
Yeah.
Let's go go to this connection between the special education. What happens to a lot of children who have difficulty with reading is that they fall out of the ability to stay with the rest of education's curriculum as it progresses.
Well, yeah.
And they fall into
Right.
special education, which now kind of envelops them in this system of becoming dependent.
Right. Well, I have taught a lot of these so-called functionally illiterates to read phonetically. So I know it can be done. But occasionally you will meet an individual who is convinced that he was born that way, that he was a born dyslexic. Now, I don't believe that anyone who has learned to speak his own language is born dyslexic, because that shows that everything is working. If you could speak your own language, your brain is okay, because speech itself is a symbolic system,
But speech doesn't have the same level of ambiguities. And the writing
No, it
system
does.
huh?
Look at children learn to speak over a long period of time where they begin to master the language. But of course, we have many words that mean different things. As I said, rain and rain, or Main and Main. Like I tell people that there are three Mains. There's Main Street, there's the horse's mane, and they fail to get the third Main. And I said, you ever heard of chow mein? In other words, you speak in context and you understand in context.
The kind of distinction that the brain has to make to the soundscape in order to differentiate and participate in oral language.
Yeah.
Or of a different order, granularity, and speed than it has to make in order to map that language.
That's true, but I am convinced that anyone who is of normal intelligence. Now I have tutored a very, very how would you say, backward or feeble-minded individual. That's what they used to call them, feeble-minded, back in the days of the guys who believed in not euthanasia. What's that term? Well, anyway, I taught him to read phonetically, but he would constantly go back to a sight way of reading. And so I would tell him to spell the word. Once he spelled the word, he was able to read it correctly. But there was a limit to what he could learn. He could only learn to read, I believe, at a second or maybe partially third grade level. That was it.
That was connected to how fast he could read.
Well, it was connected to his brain. His brain was just, was not a normal brain. It's as simple as that.
Have you encountered meaningful differences?
What is
A
that?
book called Meaningful Differences?
No, I haven't read that.
The quick summary of it is that researchers went in and spent time with families from the time babies.
Oh, yes.
They counted out the differences across the day, of language exposure the children had.
Yeah. Well, and incidentally, that's why homeschooling works so well, is because the kids are exposed to adult language much more at home than they are at school. And, this business that you have to have this very rich environment in order to learn to read is nonsense. I came from a home of immigrants. My mother was illiterate. My father was only literate in Yiddish, not even in English. I imagine he would eventually learn some words in English because he was in business and had to memorize certain words, but he didn't learn to read English. I went to a public school in New York full of immigrant kids who came from immigrant families, and we all learned to read. Nobody became dyslexic.
And you didn't have computers and television sets and CDs and boomboxes.
That's right, we had nothing.
Right into all kinds of other forms of entertainment that didn't require this.
That's right, we had nothing. Bare walls. Today you go into today's first grade classroom and every part of the wall is covered with something. You've got mobiles hanging from the ceiling. You've got fish tanks. You've got gerbils. You've got rabbits. You have the kids. When I was going to school, we sat in desks in rows, and you only looked at the back of the head of the person in front of you. The teacher was the focus of attention. And she was a very rational individual who used a very rational way of teaching. And if you talked out of turn, that was a no-no. Today, you go into today's first grade classroom, the kids now are sitting around little tables, they're talking to one another, they're pestering one another. You know, there's one kid maybe under a table somewhere reading by himself, somebody sprawled on the floor. Occasionally, the teacher will have a reading group, and they're all sitting on the floor, and she's reading to them. She's not teaching them to read, she's reading to them. Like these adults, like, you know, Laura Bush will go into a classroom and she'll read to the kids. That doesn't teach them how to read. Or when President Bush was in that classroom in, where was it, in Louisiana when 9/11 took place, what was he doing? He was reading to the kids. You know, so what a wonderful way to teach kids to read was by reading to them. Our teachers did not read to us. We had to learn how to read, you see, and she taught all of us. There were no distractions in the room. She was the focus of attention. Today, the teacher is no longer the focus of attention. She's a facilitator, and she wanders around the room, and she'll talk to this child, and she'll talk to that child, but the children have no focus of attention, and that's why you have deficit, you know, this attention deficit disorder. Kids need a focus of attention, and they're not getting it in today's classrooms. As a matter of fact, I call today's classrooms incubators for ADD, incubators for ADHD, because that's all you get there is confusion and chaos. Today's first grade classrooms are chaotic, and also the kindergartens where they're teaching cognitive skills in kindergarten and doing a horrible job of it, you know, giving them sight vocabularies to learn. So I'm very pessimistic about the public schools today because you're not going to get rid of today's first grade classrooms. You're not going to get rid of the chaos. You're not going to get back to desks bolted to the floor in rows with a teacher as the focus of attention. They're not going to do it, you see. That's why it's so easy to make such a mess of things and to create the kind of situation you're talking about with the miswiring and all of the confusion. That's all it is today in today's schools, is confusion. And that's why the kids are doing so poorly, because there is no focus of attention, there is no rational teaching, there is no understanding of how the brain works. They think they do. They've done a lot of studies of the brain, but they are totally misinformed. I mean, I understand how the brain works because I, as a writer, understand how important the focus is of attention in what you're doing and how silence is important. Now, David, if we extended this methodology, first grade methodology, to a research library, how long would the scholars be sitting there? What do the scholars need when they're learning something? Quiet, focused attention, and no disruptions from people running around and trying to look over your shoulder and say, oh, what are you reading? Can I sit and watch you and have a conversation with you? You know, so they're doing everything in the wrong way in today's primary schools, and it's the primary schools that create the problems.
And the kids are growing up thinking they're so confused.
Right. Yes, the kids are told there's something wrong with them. I mean, why are 4 to 10 million children being drugged every day in today's schools? There's something wrong with a system that requires drugging millions of children with Ritalin, Adderall, any one of these drugs. It's ridiculous. And that's because that's the only way that the educators can deal with this problem. They will not deal with it realistically. They will not realize that they have made a big mistake in going ahead with this new method of teaching. They will not go back to the old methods that worked so well. You know, Tom Brokaw wrote a book about the greatest generation. And that was the generation that was taught in the kind of schools that I attended, you know, where kids sat in rows and desks and had a teacher who was the focus of attention and taught us all, made us work. We had to work. We were not there for play. But you see, today's classrooms are play. Today's classrooms have fun and games, you know, and teaching. For example, take the way they teach reading. Today's textbooks, loaded with pictures, beautiful pictures, and a few words at the bottom of the page, you know. You don't learn to read that way. I mean, in my program, Alpha Phonics, I don't have a single picture in the book. And children learn to read very well because what are they looking at? The letters and learning the sounds. That's what they're concentrating on, and that's why they become superb readers after they've been taught to read by my method.
So much. This has been great. We've covered all the pieces.
Oh, good.
We just ran out of light.
Okay. That's right, I'm getting some sunshine.